So, if you take a look at the descriptions next to floral imagery and water imagery, you'll see this is the two focuses of this natural imagery in the text. Floral imagery, and I wrote this on here, functions as an indicator of the thinking of characters, basically. The thinking habits that they seem to have, and whether they are conducive, they are productive for the sense of empowerment that we've looked at already. You know, do the characters' ways of thinking about themselves and other people produce the mental conditions for empowerment? And that is always being sort of alluded to, implied through the way that each of those characters describes the natural world. The water imagery, which is its kind of doppelganger, it's a sort of double in the text, I think functions more as the emotional conditions of the individual in question. So if you think of these two things as actually the water as, does the character have what they need as a human being to stand a chance of thinking in a way that's going to allow them to be fulfilled? The plant images, and they are mostly plant images throughout this text, seems to represent the way that they think about themselves and other people. So if you think of it along those lines, it's emotional conditions as the water, the habits of thinking through the way that the natural world is described through imagery. You see that really carefully articulated in this passage here with Sancha and Rosa Ramsaran. They're having a discussion, and Rosa's deeply unhappy, and this is why you see water imagery crop up here. And they have this moment of connection about their own childhoods and the similarity of his own experience as a kid to hers as a mother, basically devoid of love. And this is what they talk about. He says here, he shrugged his shoulders. It would be too easy. My father, you see, only married my mother because she was the daughter of one of the richest cafeteros, coffee growers. With all due respect, I'm sure he made love to her without even speaking to her. Difficult to love children born under those conditions. In order to be able to love, you have to have received a lot in return. That was me he was describing. So she has this moment here where what she's talking about is exactly the sort of thing that gets described through water imagery in that little line there. That she knows, she struggles to love her own children because she's born under those conditions herself, and then produces this lack of emotional support in her relationships with her own children because she's experienced it herself. Sancho then says, from the time I was called curandero, I realized that the heart and mind took precedence over everything else and that the body merely obeys. I nodded in approval. It was sweet, so sweet to talk about myself, and I couldn't stop. And this is the thing here, she thinks they're having a conversation about her own life, but actually he's just talking about his own experience, but she sees this moment of connection between the two. Then she says, how true. Life's problems are like trees. We see the trunk, we see the branches and the leaves, but we can't see the roots, hidden deep down under the ground. And yet it's their shape and nature, and how far they dig into the slimy humus to search for water that we need to know. Then perhaps we could understand. And so here, in sort of paradigmatic form as a kind of model for the rest of the text, is the way that these sorts of floral images and water images function throughout the text itself. That the floral imagery is an index of what we see of the characters, how they see other people, the way they see themselves, what they understand of themselves. But then the way that the water imagery is used, the mirrors section is full of this, indicates their own kind of the emotional conditions that have developed them as people and whether they are or are not likely to experience positive emotional relationships that allow them to feel empowered. And so this is what she explains here. And it isn't any coincidence that she talks about this like trees. This seeing the trunk, seeing the branches and the leaves, but we can't see the roots. And we think of these image patterns are not arbitrarily chosen. If you think of what a mangrove is constituted from, it's constituted from a root network under the surface and then things that look like, if you don't know about biology, trees flying up through the water. And so what we see is this whole symbolism of this entire novel embodied in these two image patterns, where what we see in the mangrove swamp are the trees sticking out the surface, the isolated individuals that we notice. What we don't see are the underlying conditions under the water, the things that determine the way that certain people grow towards the light or don't. And that's why she chooses these image patterns, because they fit into this overall symbolism of a mangrove swamp being emblematic of the way that this whole community interacts with each other and makes sense of themselves. So this sort of example across here, I start with it because it sort of explicitly explains how the image patterns work. But if we jump through a few of these, you'll see what I mean by this in the context of a number of different characters. So if you go all the way back to page 2 and 3, you have to dive around the text to look for these examples quite a lot. Page 2 and 3. At the bottom here, this is in the dusk section of the opening chapter of the novel that's not narrated by an individual. It says, every day once dusk fell, she turned the key to the house where she lived alone, surrounded by memories, photographs, dozing cats and birds who built their nests in their hollows of her lampshades, and went out to take the air, walking along a straight, unswerving line from the Villa Paletti, 30 years earlier as lovely as a picture, today totally dilapidated, under trees eaten by creepers, abandoned by its owners who preferred to live in French France to the Lamont nurseries, whose entrance was barred by an iron gate and a sign saying private property. Today she'd taken a different path, what had been more powerful than years and years of habit. So this is that moment where Leocadie Timothée encounters Sanchez to trigger the whole novel. Forcing her old body, spurring it with the terror that was now boiling inside her, she made her way back to the village. With her heart racing, thumping in her ears, she climbed back up the forest track and found the footpath between the ferns, now dark owing to the late hour that came out on the road at the chapel to the Virgin Mary, Mother of all Sorrows. The dead man's house stood just outside the village, hemmed in by the forest that had begrudgingly left an opening of several miles and was anxious in its greed to win back the lost ground. Now what we've got here is a couple of examples of these moments of figurative language used to describe kind of plant life in forests that are not necessarily representative here of a character, but of a quality of the town. If you take a look at this passage here, the dead man's house, we're talking about Sanchez's property here, had stood just outside the village, hemmed in by the forest that had begrudgingly, which means that it doesn't want to, it does it unwillingly, it begrudgingly left an opening of several miles and was anxious in its greed to win back the lost ground. Absolutely. His house is surrounded by all of that natural imagery. And if you think about how this connects to the way he sees himself, what do you think the connection is between the way these plants are described, because they're personified multiple times in this passage? The forest begrudgingly left an opening, as if it doesn't want anyone to know where his house is. And then it's anxious in its greed to win back the ground, as if it's trying to almost gobble up his house so that no one ever had a record of him being here. How does that connect to the way he sees his own past and that sort of fatalistic sense of him being cursed?
As if he can never escape the past.
Exactly.
As if it's chasing him, and no matter where he goes, even if he hides out in a forest surrounded by trees, he still constantly thinks about the past.
Exactly.
I interpreted this as if the trees were actually the whole community which rely upon him to know themselves, and basically they're suffocating him in trying to know themselves to know him.
So, absolutely, you can add, that sort of thing is what you have to do in your WA. This, but it's also this, and it could be this. You sort of multiple perspectives on the same bits of text. If you think about a forest begrudgingly not wanting outsiders to see his property, there's a suggestion here that they want it to be forgotten. They want his existence here to have disappeared. And that the forest in some way wants to win back the ground that his property takes up. Well, there's a suggestion here again about the secrets that he's trying to unearth in Guadeloupe about the past, and this sense of him being cursed. and the place itself wanting him to be suffocated by it, so that those secrets are not revealed. So even though this isn't a passage of the text that is describing a character explicitly, we do see a connection between the way this natural imagery is being used and Sancho's own mental state that is something that precludes him, prevents him, stops him from being empowered mentally, because he's deeply attached to the past. So when the forest of the place is gobbling up his house, it shows you the way that he's deeply consumed with the secrets of his past and the curses, the way that the place itself seems to suffocate him. The way this natural imagery is described is giving us a lens, or sort of an insight into the nature of his
It
thinking.
also holds him back, I think.
Absolutely.
Because he is scared to start something new with a woman. He doesn't want to continue on his legacy by blood. So it's a constant fear that,
Absolutely.
like the plants, it sort of shows that once you are born in a place, the roots are always there.
Yeah.
And they will always follow you.
But that means that, this is natural. The thing that's strange about this is that we always associate natural imagery with sort of positivity. We sort of think of it to do with beauty and to do with liberation and all these things. And it is in some ways in this text, but it's both-sided. All it does is reveal the state of the character's thinking and the way that contributes to or precludes their empowerment. Here, we're very much getting a picture of Sancho's habits of thinking that stop him from being empowered. That's what we're seeing in that passage. You see it further on page 9. This bit concerns Lulu. He's talking about Sylvestre Ramsaran's crayfish advert and why it annoyed him so much. It's competitive and it wants to
I
be
have
rich.
a question. So we always talk about empowerment and disempowerment. So what do you mean by empowerment for Sancho?
For Sancho,
Like
he
to,
is
to regain his individuality and to
to live a life that is in some way fulfilling to him and with a sense of freedom. That's really what we mean by empowerment in this text. Having control over his own life and the ability to lead it in a way that gives him a sense of individual fulfillment. And he can't do that when he thinks that his whole future is determined by a curse in his family history. So in this passage here on page 9, talking about the adverts, is the person that sickened and irritated the most in Riviero's cell was Lululemon, who, like his parents and grandparents before him, played the aristocrat behind the nursery's iron gate, which in season was covered with mauve and orange flowers from the Julie creeper and trumpet hibiscus. This passage here tells us a lot about him as an individual. If you think about the way, what do you notice about this particular example of floral imagery? What's it interacting with? I mean, where's it growing physically? It's flowers. It is in the nurseries, but look at what particular physical thing that it's growing
around the iron gate.
Exactly. It's growing around something that shows us how he feels different, distinct, sense of superiority. And that's what he means by playing the aristocrat behind the nursery's iron gate. His segregation.
So it's like him being pushed out. He's like discriminating himself.
Yeah, he deliberately keeps himself separate. He deliberately keeps himself apart from everyone else because he wants to be that way. He wants to be separate and segregated. And so the fact that you have these flowers kind of growing up around his iron gate seems to, in some ways, do two things. It may be that it's sort of dampening that sense of severe superiority that he wants to give to the people he lives with. But it may also be that it's actually drawing attention to a sense of superiority, his separation. But whatever we choose to see in that ambiguity, it is emphasising some form of separation. And that's precisely the superiority that he believes he possesses. That's at the bottom of the need to be separate.
But
is exactly what
prevents
him from
why
being
does he feel the need to be separated?
because he thinks he's superior to everyone. He has a desire to be superior to everyone.
So
He has
the fact that he keeps himself separate has nothing to do with his past and how he is curious and how he wants to forget about it.
Oh, this is Lulu. This is Lulu. You know, the guy who owns the nurseries. The guy who sets up on the island a sort of prototypical plantation. You know, his nursery is like a colonial plantation in all but name. He represents the thinking of the past the most directly out of all the characters in the text. And there it is. The way that the flowers are described growing up around his gate is something that indicates that to us. It indicates his habit of thinking. If you jump forward to 14 and then 23, you'll see further examples of this. Once you've seen this, you'll see it everywhere in the text. So, this is the character who Martin tries to mispronounce his name every time I pronounce his name. Moise. I don't say Moise. I mean this. Moise.
Moise.
I read
Mosey. Yeah. Well, apparently that accent makes it a kind of sharper vowel sound. So it's supposed to be Moise. Okay. If you look at him, this imagery, remember his story with Sancho. Remember what happens to him with Francis Sancho. It's quite hard to keep track of all these different characters. Remember his...
Yeah, what happened with him?
Yeah.
First they were friends, and then Sancho saw him looking through his money and thought that he was stealing his money, so he wanted to know about Sancho.
Absolutely. So that narrative there, of optimism, he thinks he's found a friend. He's ostracized. Ostracized means to be pushed to the
The worst.
Well, Sancho thinks the worst of Muniz, but he's maligned. He's marginalised by the community. So when Sancho's nice to him, he's super optimistic. He's really happy. He thinks, "Oh, our family's going, blah blah blah." But then he has this story with him that leads to his disappointment. And you can see that emotional story through these different patterns of imagery that occur in his section of the text. It says here, in the middle of 14, it says, before he met Francis, Moise was always chattering on about how the women were barring him from their hearts and beds, how the men were ridiculing him, and how, as time went by, his dreams had withered like a tree during the dry season. After meeting him, he began to think that life would take on a new meaning, that leaves would bud on the tree of tomorrow. If you think of each of these metaphors and similes, he uses a simile here to explain his own state of satisfaction in his typical life and his typical interactions with the community. He says his dreams had withered like a tree during the dry season. It doesn't mean they're dead. Sancho's brought them back to life. It says that his life would take on a new meaning, that leaves would bud on the tree of tomorrow. So Sancho gives him this sense of renewal that you can see through the way that he uses imagery in this little passage of the text. And so you have this sense of the potential optimism and positivity that he locates in Sancho first of all through these image patterns. But then later on you see the changes in this. In 23, tiny little line in the second paragraph. When he realised that Sancho is actually not the strong man that he thought, he says this. For the time being, he had a friend, more than a friend, a child, and he realises that Sancho himself is kind of weak and vulnerable. From the very first weeks of their life together, he had realised that Francis Sancho was not at all what he imagined, not at all the tree under whose shade he could blossom. But he, again, doesn't see Sancho then as this source of power and strength that he immediately thinks he is. You know, people must judge Sancho all the way through the text because they see him as this kind of big, strong, powerful, masculine figure. Moise looks at him and thinks he's a sort of archetypal sort of alpha male figure that he is friends with. But here he realises that Sancho is vulnerable emotionally, and then uses this metaphor. He's not the tree under whose shade he could blossom. He imagines Sancho as a tree himself, offering him sort of the conditions of nurture that allow him to develop as a human being. And so this is the next sort of phase along the journey of their relationship. But then when it all goes wrong, on page 29. See the changes. These two passages here. Page 28. He says, "You think I'm after your money, but if it was money I wanted, I would have gone on boxing. I would have become featherweight champion. Doo Robinson said I had the makings of one. Money's nothing to me. I was looking to find out who you were in order to protect you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" And he's addressing Sancho. "I don't care about your money." This is after he's found him rifling through his trunk of the lawn. Those were sad days. The rain never stopped. The ravine Vilaine overflowed its banks, swelled, and in a flow of blackish silt delivered up the bodies of animals it had caught off guard in the savannas. A terrible stench rose up, and in order to drive it away, enormous quantities of incense were burnt in the shrines built into the hillsides. In those passages there, we've got the water imagery popping up first. What do you think the water imagery there has to do with his own disappointment?
It's obviously like symbolizing his maybe normal breakdown after Sancho has his rejection.
Yeah.
Because it's saying that the battle was over, so maybe he just got rid of the betrayal because of the further feeling. And it's caused disorder.
Absolutely. If you look at this in real detail, you're completely right to pick up on this, that it overflows. And you can see that sort of excess, that sense of him locating too much significance in his relationship with Sancho because of his own vulnerability. And then you get this outpouring of emotion. And its banks swelled, and in a flow of blackish silt delivered up the bodies of animals that had been caught off guard in the savannas. If you think of this figuratively, dredging up the hostilities of the past, dredging up
What's still?
like mud, like thick river mud. It also then suggests the sense of fundamental danger that his own emotional condition contains, that it catches these animals off guard in the savannas, this sort of metaphorical water that ebbs and flows. It suggests that his own emotional state is one of great vulnerability and danger if it has the potential to carry out this damage. And he says a terrible stench rose up, and in order to drive it away, enormous quantities of incense were burnt in the shrines built into the hillsides. So there's this sort of stench that this water has created in the town that they're having to try and drive away, which is supposed to be a sort of an external embodiment of his internal state of being distraught emotionally, that he's lost this one friend in whom he'd located all these significant feelings. And then Mira turns up. Mira really provokes him because he realises that Sancho is having some sort of romantic connection with her. And he hates Mira. She's really horrible to him. And at the top of the page he says this: "He's unable to believe his eyes. Maïs recognised Mira and he stood watching her, paralysed, as if he were seeing her for the first time, as if from one year to the next he hadn't seen her grow and blossom among them like a forbidden plant, whose stems, leaves and flowers exuded a poisonous perfume." So if you look at the descriptions here of the way he sees her, he hadn't seen her grow and blossom among them like a forbidden plant. He sees her located within the context of the town, but identifies that sense of her difference that they would pick up on. But all of her stems, leaves and flowers exude a poisonous perfume. That metaphorically embodies the way that she's hostile to him, and his own way of seeing her through the lens of this hostility. The way he sees her is very evident in this pattern of imagery here. It sees that as somehow enticing and exotic and foreign to him, but unjustifiably so, seeming as she has grown up around him. He doesn't really get why she gets to be special and different and have that sense of superiority over him. And all of this comes together in this final realisation a little bit further down the page. What mattered was that ever since then, his life had resumed its taste of brackish water. And brackish water is what you would find in mango stuff. It's kind of muddy and filled with little bits of sticks and twigs and things. You know, it's the dirty water, the dirty, salty water of the mangrove swamp. And his life tastes like it again. The trees of Riviera Cell had once again tightened their hold around him like the walls of a jail. And so they both operate in tandem there. And there's this taste of the salty water of the spiky mangrove swamp as a state of emotional destruction is fully registered. And then the trees seem like they're tightening around him like the walls of a jail. And they're closing in on him, and his destiny is then completely trapped to the top. You know, he feels no sense of freedom. He feels no sense of empowerment. He feels no sense of possibility because of his great disappointment in the trajectory of his relationship with Sancho.
And what did you write that he was willing to play the man game, and there's no
Crossing for him. There's no way of him getting across it if his mouth tastes of the water that you find within it. And that's where you start to see the logic behind these image patterns and how they fit in symbolically to this mangrove symbol that is constantly being alluded to all the way throughout the text. And crossing it is the thing that they were trying to do, but he fails, and you can see it through the story of what happens to these moments of flora and water imagery. It tells his narrative. If you take a look at Aristide, it tells us a very different story. You know, you'll see generally lots of what we're dealing with here are the characters who don't empower themselves. You know, we're looking here at the way this imagery actually indicates this empowerment. You'll see this with Aristide on 38 and then 46 and 7. He has a very sort of problematic connection with the natural world. So he says, at the bottom of 38 it starts, where he describes his connection to the mountains. Aristide could never live far from the mountains, right down the bottom. Every morning he delves deep into their belly and returns with his big backpack full of yellow-footed thrushes, black woodpeckers, partridges and wood pigeons that he has lined among the ferns and that he keeps in bamboo cages at the bottom of the nurseries. His realm is his greenhouse of orchids. Those people who say his heart is as hard as stone don't know him. His heart is as tender as a little child's. Now there's all sorts going on here in terms of, I think, Mira misinterpreting his own state of mind. But there's something definitely being revealed about the way he thinks in the way that he handles the natural world. What do you remember about him as a character, Aristide? He's not far off Lulu in terms of problematic methods of thinking.
No, he's very brutal with Mira and her, like where she comes from, like her mom.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's basically like Lulu, but maybe he's more isolated and searching empowerment by capturing.
Yeah. If you think of his state of mind, he is wedded to that very similar method of thinking of his father, of understanding things through the lens of hierarchy, of domination, of patriarchy, of superiority. Well, here it is, in metaphorical form with the natural world. When he interacts with the natural world, what does he do? He goes and captures things. He takes a great fascination with these exotic birds, but puts them in cages at the bottom of the nurseries, and that's where you see that sort of connection that he has with his father. His realm is his greenhouse of orchids, captured, controlled, regulated, dominated nature, not free growing, not wild and liberated. He has control of it. And again, that's indicating to us that his habits of thinking are not the habits of mind of someone that is going to lead to a sense of personal empowerment, a sense of mental freedom. You know, he has this sense of needing to dominate things. Mira misunderstands him. But from what we can glean from the way he handles the natural world, we work out that he's reliable on hierarchy and domination in order to make sense of himself. If you take a look at 46 and 7, you then see an extension of this. in his own testimony, right down the bottom of 46, he begins to describe the way he moves around the natural world. It says, only there, he's talking about needing to go into the forests, only there among the giant trees, the marbury, the châtaignier, candlewood, mastwood, and Caribbean pines, did he feel at home. He would slip into their serene and silent shadows, broken here and there by the twittering of birds, in the days when his father used to speak to him before jealousy and hatred poisoned the air between them. His father would tell of the times gone by when the rough hand of man had not yet ravished the forests of Guadeloupe, and they were teeming with all sorts of birds, macaws with breasts as red as embers, hornbills with beaks and eyes painted in crimson, fluffy green and red parakeets and parrots that could easily be taught to speak. His father would turn the pages of Nouveau Voyage aux Îles de l'Amérique. Not bad, eh? And he watched with a child's fascination at the plates, as the plates appeared one after the other. In a soft rustling of paper, it made him dream. What had his island looked like before it had been auctioned off through the greed and love of lucre of the settlers? Like the paradise his catechism described. Yes, it was Lulu who had instilled in him this love of trees and birds. Now, alas, the forest was a desecrated cathedral. He had to be content with paltry takings. It's a pretty terrible pun in that, I think. His paltry means like birds that you would, like chicken and turkey. I'm sure that can't be deliberate because it's terrible if it is.
But it's not written like that.
No, it's not the same spelling, but the way you pronounce it in English is paltry is the same. So you can't be that. His game bag heavy with wood pigeons that he had caught too easily, he made a detour by way of the waterfall des Écrivis. Who knows? Now, there's all sorts of different connotations that connect to his habits of thinking in this passage that are problematic. I mean, if you look at this first little section here and take a look at the three things that I've circled, which it won't surprise you are slightly strange. Ravished, breasts, and taught to speak. If you think about this through the lens of gender empowerment and the way that he sees the natural world almost as a blank canvas with which to express his attitude towards women, like raped. The rough-handed man had not yet ravished the forest of Guadeloupe.
Ravish is also like, they say you look ravishing.
Yet you look sexually inviting.
No, like you see grandmas saying they're like granddaughter. No, it's not that.
I'm telling you, this has a connotation of sexual violation.
Abusing.
Yeah.
Ravishing.
He envisages in this passage the forests of Guadeloupe like an abstract sort of sense of innocent femininity.
Fetishes of the natural world.
He fetishizes the natural world.
Wow.
He sees the natural world as this sort of needing to be virginal, like an innocent woman, but also a passive one, with parrots that could be easily taught to speak. So they're both innocent and they need to be silent and told how to talk. So if you think of how
That's
this
really
might
bad.
function with the way he thinks about women, you see this in exactly the way he handles his sister, the way his relationship with her goes. It's very aggressive to her. He treats her like a sexual object, even though she's related to him.
You could talk about there's no child in this.
Absolutely. You know, this passage of text and him and his father particularly invite great overlap with the count and his no child. You know, the way they think about gender is really consistent. They tell us this over the page where it says it was Lulu who had still instilled in him this love of trees and birds. So what passes off as this sort of great passion for the natural world. You know, we think of the kind of David Attenborough nature documentary and being this kind of benign, beneficent, kindly sort of thing. You know, people don't tend to go and look at birds through binoculars instead of wild, misogynistic kind of ideologues. But the way he's looking at the natural world is emblematic of his patriarchal ideology. And he's learnt it from his father. It's him who has instilled this in him. Now, alas, the forest was a desecrated cathedral. This ideal abstraction of innocence that he sees the forest as has been destroyed. It's been tainted like a woman who's had sex. That's the kind of subtext of this. It's a desecrated cathedral. You had to be content with paltry takings. When meager. I really hope that's not a deliberate pun because it's really rubbish if it is. You had to be content with meager takings is the other word for that, like very few takings. But he still sees this as something that he should ravish and hunt and take from rather than some sort of equal that he respects and venerates because of its beauty. He sees it as something that he can dominate and tame.
Could you talk about the evidence of weird fetishes between this and Death in Venice?
Well, there are odd sexual fetishes in lots of these texts. This one, Death in Venice, Snow Child, most definitely. Even some of the other ones.
Well, Rose Granley.
Absolutely. There's some very weird fetishes around mortality in that. And even Kew Gardens and Hills Like White Elephants have some strange sort of sexual subtext.
It just talks about abortion.
It does, but there's some weird
and
sort of...
how sexually active he is because there's like stamps of all hotels he's been with.
Exactly, there you go. There's never throwaway details in Hemingway. They're always there on purpose. If you look at this little passage, this tells you all you need to know about his relationship with his sister. She talks... It's 40. Close. So she says here on 40, when she spent the moments with Sancho. Up until then, I had caressed only one familiar body. He's talking here about Aristide. That held no mystery and was as close to mine as the trunk of the candlewood is to the epiphytical philodendron. Now, neither did I when I read this. I think because I was trawling through the text for all these different examples of natural imagery, I think this has got to be connected to their weird incestuous relationship in some way. Turns out it is. An epiphytical philodendron. The only reason I thought about this, it's a type of plant, but philo, obviously the Greek stem of that is to do with love. Exactly. If you're a bibliophile, you love books. If you're an Anglophile, you love English people.
You love plants.
If you're a philodendron, dendron, the word comes from the Greek for tree. It means you love trees. Now this particular plant, an epiphytical philodendron, is named that way because it grows within the trunk of a tree and it is symbiotically connected to the tree. And so when she says here the trunk of the candlewood is to the epiphytical philodendron.
Oh my god, so it's like literally
It's their weird incestuous relationship within this plant-like metaphor.
But it's just explaining how close they were sexually.
Exactly.
And then using the metaphor of this plant.
They're entangled as one. So you've got all of the weird, creepy connotations of the fact that they are as one. They are half the same family. They're not quite the same family. So this sort of metaphor aptly creates that sense of, yes, they are different, but they're deeply entangled, and that's what makes it weird.
What is she going with him then?
I think I don't really know the details of her connection with him, but I think in terms of what we can work out from her own emotional state, she seems to long for comfort, company, and he's very forceful and aggressive. I think with the way he treats her, and I think she just sort of is kind of naive and gets kind of bullied into it. That would be my guess, but there's no real explicit description of the way they interact together. But you can again, if you think of Aristide and Wais, they really give you the narrative of their methods of thinking and the way they interact with others through this kind of floral and water imagery. We'll stop there for now because there's a ton of this, and I think dealing with this will probably take us up to